Hello, and welcome to your week 3 ancillary session. As you know, career services is coming in this week, so I wanted to make sure that you still receive the information as well as the apply and reflection. So here we are. This week, you are going to read on chapter 4, but we're talking about inpatient bed occupancy. And as you see in the little, I guess, somebody's been sleeping in my bed, kind of, you know, make it a little bit funny, right? Okay, so getting into chapter 4, we have to determine the beds that are included in a bed count. We also have to analyze the bed occupancy percentage. We have to summarize the direct and indirect bed turnover rate, formulate the direct and indirect bed turnover rate, and then construct the percentage of occupancy for a period when there has been a change in the number of beds during that particular period. Now, with everything in statistics, we have to kind of explain what we're talking about it. So, we know that facilities are licensed to operate with a specific number of beds, right? They have to apply for a CON, certificate of need, saying that this is how many beds that we need for whatever type of facility that we are opening, that we have open, that we are planning on continuing in the future. Now, the bed count is the number of beds staffed, maybe less than the licensed number of beds. Okay, so it's the number of beds that are where patients are actually in the bed. Now, what that's saying is you may be licensed to have 50 beds, but maybe you only have 40 patients. We look at the number of available inpatient beds. So in a hospital, that includes beds set up for normal use, whether or not they are occupied. They may be reported for the entire hospital or for any of its individual units. For example, ICU, the burn unit, neonatal units, and so on. In a hospital, right, you have the number of available beds in a unit. They remain consistent for long periods of time. Now, you see that it says the number can change, and often it does. Some beds may be unavailable during, let's say, they're remodeling parts of the hospital or there's a huge renovation project. Well, then, of course, those beds are not going to be available, or it may increase after the project is completed. Now, we have the fact that they can increase during a disaster, right? You see in front of you regular beds, they can be occupied. And so we got to find another space. Those beds do not become a part of the regular bed count. They're referred to as disaster beds. Now, the hospital bed complement is the number of beds for the admission of inpatients and day cases using an inpatient bed. The other names, as you see, bed capacity. Now, it can be confusing because it also denotes the number of beds that a faculty has been designed and constructed to contain. All right. These are beds that are not included. Treatment rooms, examining rooms, emergency services, physical therapy, labor rooms, recovery, newborns beds, which are actually called bassinets. These are not included in inpatient counts. And if you look up there, it kind of makes sense. Well, with a treatment room, the patient's not going to be there for very long. In any of these rooms, even if you're laboring and you're laboring for a couple days, it's temporary because you're going to be moved to somewhere else. Again, labor rooms are not included. They are used temporarily before the inpatient delivers. So it's just temporary holding Got you here for a second. And then we're going to move you and your child. You look in front of you, you have the number of available hospital newborn bassinets, both occupied and vacant on any given day. So you're just kind of getting a visualization of what may be documented and how many patients are located in certain areas. You have your emergency departments. Now, you see that facilities may provide an observation bed in the emergency department. Now, if observation beds meet the qualifications of being set up, equipped, and staffed for inpatient use, they may be counted in the bed count depending on what the facility has decided and on state licenses compliance. Now, this refers to the sum of inpatient bed count days for each of the days in the period under consideration. They can be referred to as a maximum number of patient days or potential days because they represent statistical probability of every bed being occupied every day. Now, if the hospital beds were filled each day, the occupancy rate would be 100%. In most cases, that's not what happens, right? So keep that in mind. Here we look at the ratio, bed occupancy rate by the percentage. Let's get into the formula. Let's get into the meat and potatoes. You have bed occupancy ratio, total inpatient service days in a period, divided by total bed count days in that same period. We're getting into our very first example. Okay, so grab your calculators and work this out as I'm going through it. General Hospital changed its official bed count from 50 to 75 on May 15th and provided a total of 1,700 inpatient service days for the month of May. What were General Hospital's bed count days for May? What was the occupancy rate? And then you're rounding to one decimal place. Bed count, you have 14 times 50. Keep in mind, it changed from 50 to 75 on May 15th. So from days 1 through 14, right? It's 50. And then the rest of the month, it changed to 75. You end up with 700 plus 1,275, 1,975. So the bed count days for May are 1,975. All right. But we're not done. Now we compute the bed occupancy ratio. Calculation is total inpatient service days in a period divided by total bed count days in a period. So these are two parts. Okay. We had to find the bed count. Now we're finding the occupancy rate. Bed count for May, 1,975, right? If you guys remember that the total inpatient service days was 1,700, which means we have 0.861. The bed occupancy rate or ratio for May is 0.861 or 86.1%. Multiply by 100. Okay, so that's how you get that answer. Other terms, other names, percent of occupancy, occupancy rate, occupancy percent, percent of occupancy, and of course, occupancy ratio. Now, change in bed count can often happen, right? Disasters you see in front of you would not necessarily change everything. We're talking about a permanent change, not something that's there to meet an emergency. Other things that would not change bed count would be labor beds, physical therapy beds, and so on, right? Let's get into the newborn bassinet occupancy ratio. Now, in this particular example, typically, newborn occupancy ratios are computed using the same methodology as adult and children beds. If every bassinet were filled every day in the period, the hospital would have the maximum potential bassinet occupancy or newborn bassinet count days. The formula for determining the bassinet occupancy is looking at the total newborn inpatient service days in a period and dividing that by total newborn bassinet count days. Looking at our example, during July, a hospital with a bassinet count of 30 provided 874 newborn inpatient service days of care. Calculate the newborn occupancy percentage and round to one decimal place. Give your newborn occupancy rate, 874 newborn inpatient service days divided by the bassinet count of 30 times 31 days, which are in July. Make sure you're calculating as you're looking at this. I got 874 divided by 930. Okay, hopefully you receive the same number. $0.940 or 94%. Another calculation that we have to cover is bed turnover rates. Your BTR measures productivity of hospital beds, and it represents the number of patients treated per bed in a defined period, usually 1 year. Okay, usually 1 year. Now, with this, you have direct and indirect formulas. With the direct formula, number of discharges, including deaths for a period, divided by the average bed count during the period, versus your indirect occupancy rate times a number of days in a period divided by the average length of stay during that same period. Now, bed occupancy rate has remained as the most important parameter to evaluate the utilization of hospitals. The patient turnover rate was calculated as an absolute count of admissions, discharges, and deceased patients for a particular day divided by the total number of patients for that day per hospital. So we look at the calculation and we have an example in front of us. We calculate the turnover rate for a community hospital using both the direct and indirect calculations. Any differences in the results are due to rounding the statistics used in the calculation. So we're going to perform the calculation by hand to demonstrate the impact, all right? So you have our bed turnover rate. We're doing the direct formula first. We have the number of discharges, 7,054, including deaths, for the period by average bed count during that same period, which was 200. You can see the 200 right here, right? 200 beds. We end up with 7,054 divided by 200, 35.3. Now that was the direct formula. With the indirect, okay, we have the occupancy rate times number of days divided by average length. So 0.85 times 365, it is a non-leap year divided by the 9 days. Here we have 310.25 divided by 9 equaling 34.5. Okay. Now, if we were to round, these would both say 35, correct? But Here, it's letting us know that we want to round to one decimal place. Another example, we have community hospital, 200 beds, 6,500 discharges. Length of stay was 9 days, bed occupancy is 80%. We're going to do the indirect formula. So here we're taking the 80 times 365. It's a non-leap year, divided by 9 days, average length of stay. Gives us 292 divided by 9, 32.4, because we rounded to the nearest decimal place, 32.4%. Your formula page, you have inpatient bed occupancy, newborn bassinet occupancy, bed turnover, indirect, as well as direct. For your applying reflection, you'll need to keep the formulas near you. For the first example, in order to find the newborn bassinet occupancy, you will take 12,732 inpatient days and divide by the bed and multiply by 365, which is the amount of days in the year. Pull out your calculators and let's see what everyone gets. All right. You should have gotten 0.872, turning it into a percentage, multiplying by 100, 87.2%. Let's try another one. We know that this is a 15-bed surgical intensive care, all right, with 400 inpatient service days. We also know that there are 31 days in March. So as we answer the second question, we're going to take the 400 inpatient service days divided by the 15-bed surgical intensive care, but that has to be multiplied by 31. Giving us 400 divided by 465, or 0.860, with a final answer of 86%, rounding to one decimal place. And you'll notice that that decimal is followed by a 0. It has to be there in order for your answer to be correct, because it says to round to one decimal place. Okay. Now, the bed turnover rate refers to the number of times a bed on average changes occupants during a given period. We look at the bed turnover rate going by the direct formula. It tells us, using the direct formula, what was the bed turnover rate for March. 545 discharges. How do we know? It tells us that in March, there were 545 discharges, including deaths. We're going to divide that by the 120 bed facility. Gives us 4.541666667, or 4.15. So this week you have patient services coming in, okay? Career services, I don't know, I'm talking about patients. Career services are coming in, which means that we are going to go over our math trivia. We've already done our apply and reflection, and we covered chapter 4 with inpatient bed occupancy. You will be getting your highly missed questions prior to the live session, but that's going to be pre-recorded and time-stamped for y'all. Career Services is going to give you some amazing information on resumes. And that's all, folks. I hope to see everyone in next week's live session with Career Services. Let's talk about some resumes. Make sure to have your resumes on hand and ready and have questions.